we essentially started our basic server-side programming and coding by getting an introduction to server controls in ASP.NET Framework. And we saw how we could create elaborate designs with very little effort and very little programming using the server controls that Visual Web Developer basically provides us with. And I showed you very simple coding, and I told you that we will see more details about C# coding for our ASP.NET websites. And we will continue with more advanced server controls this week, and I will talk about and introduce you to the ASP.NET State Engine, which is an integral part of the ASP.NET framework that allows the server controls, each of the server controls who need to maintain their states or their status across postbacks to the server, to retain their states. And this simplifies the coding and the programming of the active server pages.NET a lot more than the classical ASP and the PHP programming. So we'll start with getting an overview of other types of server controls. I won't go to the detail of them, as we will study them in detail in the future lectures. I will just introduce you to them, and then we'll talk about the ASP.NET State Engine, and we'll see how the State Engine works by an example of a calendar application. We talked about simple server controls that the ASP.NET Framework and the Visual Web Developer basically had. They were server controls that work on the server, and they are essentially the controls whose tag starts with ASP, followed by a colon, followed by the name of the control. There is another category of the server controls called HTML controls, and this HTML category are basically within the toolbox, and they are HTML controls that look pretty much similar to the ones that are in the standard category. So for example, you may find a input control that looks very much like a button in the classic server controls, or essentially the simple server controls category. And also the select server control, select HTML control exactly looks like a drop-down list and the list box in the server controls. These are, though, HTML controls, and they are client-side controls as opposed to ASP.NET server controls, which were server-side controls. And they are basically, after you process your website and the ASP.NET runtime processes the website, these server controls would directly end up in the final HTML code in the browser. We can expose these HTML controls to the server side by making their run@, attribute equal to server. This way, although these are client-side controls, they will be run at server. However, their code will still end up the same in the client-side machine. When we expose this HTML controls to the server side, this will enable us to program against these HTML controls from the code behind file of our web form, and we could basically influence their visibility, for example. And as I said, if you make a control invisible on the server side, when the server ASP.NET runtime processes them, and their visibility had made to be disabled or false, the HTML code for those controls will not be emitted to the final HTML program that would end up on the browser. However, these HTML controls don't have the functionalities that we could find in the standard categories. For example, if you look at the select control or any other HTML control, such as input control, the Visual Web Developer does not support them in the design time, and so we could not add items as easily as we did, like list item collection, to the ASP drop-down list or ASP list box. We cannot do that. We cannot go to the design view and automatically add item list collections to or item lists to the HTML controls. They do lack the design time support, and this forces us to write program in the markup view of the Visual Web Developer for these controls. The idea here, or the issue, is that why use them, and actually when to use HTML controls when we have ASP server controls that look very much like HTML controls, and they already run on this at the server. There seems to be a lot of overlap between the HTML and standard control categories, but we need to consider how and when we should use them. The server controls are generally much more, basically, in terms of the things that they would offer us to do, especially when it comes to design time support in Visual Web Developer and the functionalities that they have and then they can do in at the runtime. But this functionality comes at a price. Because their complexity is much more than HTML controls. The server controls take a little more time to process, and therefore your ASP runtime should spend a little bit more time per ASP control rather than the time that it spends on the HTML controls. Unless you have a very complicated website which has a lot of controls, especially lots of server controls, you probably won't notice a difference between using HTML or server controls. But when you are having a high traffic website and lots of customers and lots of people are coming back and forth to the website, and there's lots of controls on the web page, the HTML controls give a little bit better of performance boost if used properly, and they consume less memory on your server compared to their server control counterparts. In most scenarios, however, we do favor server controls over their HTML counterparts, because server controls, first of all, as I said, offer more flexibility. They give more flexibility to the pages, because they have a lot more different categories. Also, they allow us to create a much more or richer user experience by exploiting all their functionalities. And also, they're much better supported in design time, and it makes it easier to use them and to manipulate them from the design view of Visual Web Developer, rather than having to write the HTML tag for all of their properties and attributes. Another type of controls that Visual Web Developer gives us is a type that's called data controls. Data controls were basically introduced in ASP.NET 2, and they allow us an easy way to access various different types of data sources, such as links to databases, XML files, or other objects in our website. And instead of writing a lot of code and program to access a data source, as you had to do with earlier versions of ASP.NET or even the classical ASP, you just simply point your data source or your data control to the appropriate data source, and you create a simple node to it, and then the ASP.NET runtime takes care of the most of the difficult issues, connecting your controls to your web pages to your data sources, and this way you can essentially work a lot more with the data and the dynamic data on your websites. And if we don't run out of time by the end of this semester, we probably will see how we can use these data controls. There's another set of controls called validation controls, and this allows us to rapidly make web forms with variation rules that prohibit users from entering invalid data. For example, we can force the user to enter just values that are basically required values, and check if the data that they entered or the values they entered matches a specific format, like a valid date or a number between 1 and 10. For example, if you're asking for a student ID and a person types in letters instead of the student ID, you can automatically use validate controls to detect that this was a mistake and point that mistake to the user so that they would be able to correct it and use the website more properly. Using validation controls, we can also write custom code to create validation routines that they are not covered by the standard controls. And what we could do is that they can be executed both on the client and the server, and this way we can create responsive and secure applications. We will see how we can use this these kinds of controls a little bit later, probably in the next week or so, or maybe the week after that, and essentially use these controls to create much richer and more secure websites. Another set of controls is essentially a type of control that lets the user find their way through the website. And these controls are called navigation controls. There are several kinds of these controls, starting from a tree view, a sitemap path, and essentially a menu kind of navigation control. The tree view control is basically a hierarchical display of the data that can be used to show the structure of your website, and this way users can get easy access to all the pages in the website. The menu control exactly does the same thing, or at least similar thing, and it provides options for being a vertical menu or a horizontal menu. And I showed you in the programming assignment, you created a menu with CSS or cascading style sheets, essentially with very little effort in terms of programming, but rather more of a cascading style sheet design using the IDs. And the menus in the navigation controls basically create that functionality, but with a lot more interesting visual effects. The AJAX extension that was designed and integrated into the ASP.NET in November 2005 became the first extension that was added as an add-on to the later versions of ASP.NET framework, starting from 2.0, and it's essentially integrated in 4.0 as well, and that's the version of the ASP.NET that we're using. These extensions basically allow us to create Flickr-free web applications by letting the application to retrieve the data from the server from a client-side JavaScript without actually having to perform a full postback. Essentially, you can think of it actually as allowing us to retrieve parts of the web page when needed, instead of having to reload the entire web page or the entire ASP.NET website through a complete postback. And since 2005, it has been essentially integrated and fully placed into the .NET frameworks, and Visual Web Developer 2008 has it fully integrated, has these extensions fully integrated, and in 2010 it has been updated to AJAX 4, which is the latest version of this this technology. And later on we will actually study a little bit about the AJAX and how this these extensions would give a lot more functionality and faster and Flickr-free interactions with the client-side and the server-side programs. ASP.NET Web Parts are also a set of controls that let you use basically the web page, or let the users change and manipulate the appearance of the web pages and the behavior of the websites by interacting with the site itself. So users can change the entire appearance of the website, rearrange the contents, hide or show some parts of the web page, and adding other fragments and components to the website with very little effort. And essentially, if you look at the Blackboard, it's kind of sort of like that you can have some of the courses shown, some of the courses hidden, and so forth. We probably won't talk about these web parts in detail because they are outside the scope of this this class, but essentially those are also components and controls that Visual Web Developer essentially has and gives us, it puts it at our disposal to use for that kind of manipulation of the websites. Another kind of controls that ASP.NET framework supports and the Visual Web Developer provides are dynamic data control, and these are essentially the controls that are used to create dynamic data websites. For example, they can enable you to interface and manage the data in a database, and or any other types of dynamic data. And we will not consider these kinds of controls also in this class. That those would be essentially more or less advanced ASP programming for manipulation of the dynamic data. So we have so far created websites and web pages and replaced text boxes, button controls, list boxes, and things like that in the examples that we have seen so far. And for example, what we did in an earlier example, we created a text box, and then we typed some text in the text box, and we pressed a button. When the button was pressed, this action or this event caused a post back to the server, and when the page was loaded, if you remember, the text was still in the text box. Basically, we didn't do much in terms of asking the website to maintain the value of the text box when the page was reloaded from the server. We also did pretty much the same thing when we created the wizard control, and when we were clicking the we were changing the values from the text box and the drop-down lists. All of those values basically retain their value. All of those text box and controls return their appropriate values, and we actually didn't do much of any coding at all. This, for those who are new to the internet programming and haven't done much of an HTML or classic ASP or PHP programming, might strike a little bit odd, and essentially might feel like, well, what's going on? Because when you're coding in PHP or older technologies such as ASP, classic ASP, you probably would have to you probably remember and know already that in order for a text box after a postback to retain its value, you have to do a lot of coding actually to make this happen. But with the ASP.NET, it did actually automatically work, and you didn't even have to basically write any extra codes. So how does this work? This is essentially the component of ASP.NET that makes takes the stage from the HTML stateless entities to the ASP.NET state engine. This state engine is a feature that is deeply integrated into the ASP.NET runtime, and one of its functionalities is that it enables the controls to maintain their state, or essentially their values, across postbacks. So when you're pressing buttons or you're causing postbacks to the pages, to the server, you won't have to worry about losing the states or the information that you already typed or you already entered somehow or another to the controls of your web pages. So now, what is a state, and why it is important to have and maintain a state? To understand the state, it's important to basically look back at the design of HTTP, or the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, the protocol that is used to request and serve pages in a web browser. This protocol, if you remember from the reading sections that I gave you, is a stateless protocol. Basically, you make a request to the server, and the server responds and gives the information you requested back. And any request that you send to the server, it's basically disregards any history of requests that were made to the server and or responses that were given. So every single request stands as a standalone request with no information and interaction from the previous requests and responses from the server. What this means is that the web server does not keep track of any requests that you have been making from a specific browser, let alone from a specific website or web page. As far as the web server is concerned, each of these requests are essentially standalone, and they are basically on their own. So the web server does not have any recollection of the pages that you requested previously, nor does it have any recollection of the types of requests or the content and the information that you requested previously. So it's essentially an interesting problem. So if you wanted to have a simple login page, and that users would type their usernames and their passwords, and then they press login, and ideally you would like to, if the user does not press login, does not type their passwords correctly, you would like to retain the username so the user can, instead of retyping their username back, they could just simply type their password if it was just a small typo in their password and they couldn't get through. And doing so in PHP and actual classical ASP, you might know it requires coding, whereas the ASP.NET state engine would automatically maintain or retain the values that the user has typed into their username. So the process that, for example, in simple login, you have two text boxes. You have a username text box and password text box, and the user types the username and the password and then presses the login button. This process happens in a web page cannot essentially retain these values, because when you make any request, including pressing the button with the username and password, it is basically a standalone request, and the server does not fill the text box again after the postback, because when the page is served with the statement saying that, for example, the password or username were incorrect, the server does not remember what values for username and password was sent to it during the postback, so it would be able to repopulate the username field. So to get around this, as I said, you'd have to write a good chunk of code manually to pre-populate controls after a postback. ASP.NET takes care of this situation by integrating a state engine functionality into the ASP.NET feature set. So just to show you how the state engine works, let's create a simple calendar application, and I'll show you how this essentially works in the actual website that we create. And then we start dissecting the process and understanding the state engine and how the state engine works. One thing to notice is that the state engine in ASP.NET can store state for many controls. It can store for simple controls like text box and checkboxes, essentially retaining their values, all the way to more complicated controls like a calendar. And with this example, I'd like to show you how the state engine actually work in a calendar-based application, and then we'll talk about the details of this process. Okay, so let's see an example here. Now, to show you how this works, I have created a page called states.aspx, and that's essentially my form that I want to create. And also, you need to make sure that the code behind file is selected, so it uses a code behind. And the language that I'm using here is C#. And if I click on the states.aspx.cs, that is the code behind file, which contains my C# codes. Now let's go back to the state. And what I want to do here is I want to insert a table, and then I'll insert a calendar, label, and a couple of buttons, and see how it works. So let's drag and drop a table in here, and or let's do that in the design view. Makes it faster to design. Let's go to design view, and let's go to the table and insert. Click in the div section, click on table, click on insert table, and then make it to have 2 by 2, and everything else you can leave it by default. So here it adds a 2 by 2 table to your design view. Let's run it on the browser. And so this is the page. I don't have anything in the table, so nothing is shown essentially. So let's go back to the page and let's drag a label in the first cell and call this label, delete the label text, and its label ID will be the date, and let's drag a button in the second cell or second column, and let's call the text of this button set date, and let's go all the way down and make its ID set date. And remember that the IDs have to be one word, you can't use spaces. Let's drag a calendar and let's drag another button and call this button, let's make the text plain post back and the label plain post back. Okay, just before I start working with, here is the calendar server control, and let me just show you how you can format this server control. If you click on the Smart Task and click on the Auto Format, you'll see that it removes the formatting and it allows you to choose simple format, professional formats, classic format, colorful, and stuff like that. So let's select the simple formatting, and here's how your calendar would look like in your pages. So let's run this page in the browser, and here's my my browser page, and if I press set date, if I press plain post back, nothing will happen. Essentially what happens is that if I click set date, a post back happens and you see the page reloads. If I click plain post back, a post back happens and I see and you see that the page reloads. But I don't have any codes associated with these two buttons, therefore nothing seems to be happening. When you click on any date, you'd see that another post back happens to the server, and essentially it would send to the server the date that you have clicked. Now let's go to the set date button and let's write a code in the set date button event, and when it's clicked, let's write the today's date and time, make it into a string and put it into the text of the label that I created here, and the label is called the date. So double click on the set date, and so when you double click in the code behind file, the Visual Web Developer automatically creates an event for you called set date click, and you can program against the components. So you would like to put the set date text component to be equal to the date time of the server. You want the current date and time, and you want to make this into a string. Basically what you want to happen is when you click on the set date, whatever date you have selected here becomes the today's date, and it becomes it turns into a screen, and it would be written into the date's label or the date label text. So let's run this. Let's go back to our browser. Now I have my latest version run, and if I click on set date, oops, I put it into the text of the wrong value. I put it in the text of the label. I need to put it on the date. So let's double click on the set date, and it should be the date. Let me point out the mistake I made. I had put this text into the text of set date. Now let's go back to our design view. Set date is the button, but the date is the label that I wanted to run. So let's run the code one more time. And so if you click on set date, the date will be there will be a post back to the server, and today's date, current date, and time will be turned into a screen and put into the label 9:30, 2010, 7:10, 11 p.m. If you press set date, it refreshes to today's date, and when you press plain postback, you see the date is still out there. Although there is nothing associated with the plain postback in terms of the code, the date is still set. And but when you click on the set date one more time, it refreshes the current time and date. When you choose a different date from calendar, a postback happens, but since there's no code associated with this postback, this date and time, the last date and time that you assign to the label, will be shown on your browser. Essentially, this is the state of your browser. Whenever you create any postback which does not change the state of the browser or the state of this particular label on top here, it would still be maintained within the page. When you create a postback that would make changes to the state or the value of this label, that change will be effective. To show you how this essentially works, let's go to the label, click on the label, and from the properties grid, scroll down to the enable view state property. Enable view state, which by default is true, it allows the ASP.NET Framework to retain the state of this server control across the postbacks, meaning that whatever value you assign to them and their properties, they would be maintained within the state of the ASP.NET Framework across several postbacks to the server, and the states wouldn't change. Let's make this state view disabled by just making the enable state view false. And now let's run our document. And let's go back to the browser. Now if I click the set date, the postback happens, and the date will be posted into the the date and time will be posted into the label. Now if I click a plain postback, there is no code associated with the label of this page, and therefore the view state is disabled, and therefore it would clear up the value of the label, because the view state for this label is essentially disabled. The ASP.NET does not keep track of its value that was previously assigned to it, and whenever you refresh the postback or refresh the page or create a postback to the server, it would populate it with the default value or the value that you assign to it. A plain postback does not assign any value to it, therefore the default value, which is an empty string, will be associated to it. The set date button, on the other hand, according to this behind code C# program, makes changes to the label's text, and therefore that text will appear when you click on set date. When you click on a default postback or a plain postback that does not make any changes to the label, it would clear it up and essentially assign to it its initial value. Next, I'll show you what happened here, and we'll see how this view state of the ASP state engine makes all this possible. So essentially, to understand how this all works, we need to basically remember and look at some important elements. The first element that we need to remember is essentially the form element, or the way that the HTML source code in the final markup that was created by the ASP.NET, how it looks and how it actually represents the data. So if we go back to the page that we have here and right-click on the page and click on View Source Code, you will see that the page is essentially an HTML page, and it's basically composed of a form which has all the information about the how the page has to be processed. So if you look at the form, you see that the form actually has a method of presenting the data through the postback, and it basically posts back to another form. Actually, it posts back to its own form, or its own ASPX page, which is the states.page. Now, what this all means is that the HTML form is the element that enables you to submit information from the browser to the server. Basically, within the form, you can enter any information you want within the controls, such as text boxes, in this case buttons, calendars, and labels, and drop-down lists, and so forth. And then when you create, when you click on the form or make any kind of postback through, for example, in our case, clicking on a date on the calendar or clicking on either one of the two buttons that we created, the data will be within the form will be submitted to the server. A form can submit its data in two ways: a post method or a get method. Basically, as I showed you, the method here that the form we created would communicate with the server is the post method, and you can see it from up here. When you use the post method to submit the data to the server, all of the data from the form will be added to the body of the request, and then it will be sent to the server. In the case of the get method, all the data will be appended at the end of the actual address, and then will be sent as the appended to the actual address to the request. There are subtle differences between the two methods, but that's not important right now. What is important is that the form element is essentially used to encapsulate form controls whose values are submitted back to the server within a big chunk of data. And when you click on a button, for example, or on a date in the calendar that we just created, a postback to the server will be created, and you need to post back all of the relevant information within the form will be submitted to the server by either one of the post or the get methods, and then the page will be rebuilt. Now, all of the ASP web forms by default use the post method to send the data to the server, generally the ASP.NET pages, the entire pages, always contain one form, and so in this case, because this is just such a general strategy, when you create an ASPX or ASP.NET web form in Visual Web Developer, it automatically creates the form element for you, so you don't have to do it yourself. Another important aspect of the ASP form web forms is that the ASP.NET web forms by default always submit back to themselves. So in other web environments like ASP or PHP, you might remember or you might notice that usually you create an action attribute to a page and make it point to a second page. So basically what you will do is that you get the values from web form in one page and submit the information to a second page to process the data. But in ASP.NET, you can't do that. You have to submit the information within the form to the same page or to the same ASP.NET web form. And if you don't do that, it would create an error for you. Let's look back into the source code a little bit more. So if you notice here, the source code has a set of hidden values, and one of the hidden values or hidden elements that is created is called view state. So this hidden view state field is a component that your ASP.NET framework creates and emits its HTML code And what it does is that this the text that is put in the value of this hidden element contains critical information, and what this information is exactly the view state of your pages, or essentially contains the state of each, or the value of each server control that has to be maintained within the postbacks or across the postbacks. At first, the text appears to be basically random characters, but the important thing here is that to protect your information, these fields are essentially converted or essentially coded to the string that you see here, and the ASP.NET framework and your HTML browser would recognize it and will be able to populate your web pages when the browser is rendering it by looking at the values of this view state or this hidden field, and populate the appropriate fields and controls with the appropriate values. So when your ASP.NET page loads, the ASP.NET runtime fills this hidden field with the information about your page. So for example, the text property of the label 1 control was blank, and when you set it by the set date button, and you click the set date button, its value gets calculated within the ASP runtime, and after the page is posted back, and it would be populating the label text that we had, and then this value, which is the current date, will be written into the hidden state value, which is this hidden field up here. And then if you refresh your browser and refresh the page without making any changes to the label text field, the hidden state retains its value within this view state field, and therefore your browser, when rendering and refreshing the page, would repopulate the value of your label text with the value that is given within its hidden state. So in our example, if you remember, and let me show you one more time as to what happens. So here, back in the markup control, let's make the enable view state of the label to essentially be default, which is true, and let's run the page. And let me just click once on the set date, and you see that the current time and date is updated. And let me click on the post back, and although it was posted back, the state of this label field was retained. Essentially, the hidden field of view state contained and maintained the value of this label box here. Now, just to show you what happened, when I requested the page in the browser got the page from the server by making a request for it. The ASP.NET runtime then reads the page file from the disk and then processes it and sends the resulting HTML to the browser. At this stage, all of the controls have their own default values, including the label, whose default value is empty for the text, and therefore nothing is shown on the browser, on the label text. After the page got displayed in the browser, I clicked the Set Date button. This caused a post back to the server. At the server, the page was reconstructed again, and in this case also, like the first time it was loaded, all of the default values were placed in the controls. And all the controls still contain their default values. So again, label 1 control text property is set to basically empty, and there's no text in it. After the default values have been set, the runtime essentially overrides the default value for the text of the label by the current date and time, which was given by the C# program. And at this point, the value of the label changed from empty to the current date and time, and this value was sent to the view state. Next, when I click on the plain postback button, what happened is that a postback was caused to occur, and the page was requested again from the server. Then the page was constructed again, and all of the default values were set. At this stage, the text value of the label is empty because it's the default. However, after the defaults are set during the same processing cycle, the runtime, the ASP runtime processes the view state, and when it decodes the view state, it finds the set value for the server controls, including the label text, which was from the hidden view state field, and repopulates the default values with the values of the text properties and the server controls that are in the view state. And in this case, you would, instead of the default value or an empty value for the label, final look of the page will contain the time and date which was set for the label into its view state. So at any further future time, when you click on postbacks that do not manipulate the text property of the label, first the default values will be set. Once the default values are set, the ASP framework processes the hidden state or the view state and repopulates the text of the label with the last value that you stored, which is stored in the view state of the system. Now, if I disable the view state of the text property, which I will do now, and I'll show you how it works, the ASP.NET framework repopulates the page whenever a postback occurs. When the postback occurs, the default values of everybody, including the label text, will be placed in the final look of the browser. But because the label is now its view state is disabled, it won't have a representative in the view state. So while the ASP.NET runtime framework is processing view state, it wouldn't see anything in it from the label because it's disabled, and therefore the default value which was empty will always be set. So let's run over the process one more time. Now, if you notice, the label is essentially its enable view state is true because it's by default. Now let's run the page one more time, and when you run the page is requested from the server. It's read from the hard or the memory, and all of the default values are set. So set date and plain postback are by default. They don't have any property that you could manipulate. So does the calendar. And the label's text is the default empty text. When I click on the set date, the moment I click on the set date, the page is requested through a postback, and when the page is processed and recreated, the default values are set. So its text will be empty. But during the runtime, the ASPX .cs or the code behind file runs and repopulates the value for the text, the text of the label, and at the same time puts this value into the view state of the engine. Now, if I click on the plain postback, a postback will be sent to the server, which just happened. All the default values will be set, including the label text, which is empty. The view state will be processed, and within the view state, this text is created and stored from the previous action I took for the text of this label. And the ASP runtime overrides this default value by the value that came from the view state. If I go here and disable the view state of my label, which says enable view state false, and run my page, the moment I run the page, the server request is sent and the page is reloaded. All the default values are set. When I click on the set date value, the label date will be processed and refreshed on the memory and replacing the default value of the, the text of the label. However, when I click on the plain postback, the page is reloaded with all the default values. The ASP.NET Framework processes the view state and doesn't see any information to override the default value of the label text, and it retains the empty default value for it. When I click on the set date, once the page is reconstructed, at the first step, the empty values are loaded to the text for the label as default, and when the program, the C# program runs, it overrides the default values by the current time and date. But since the view state is disabled, it would not write this current time and date into the view state, and therefore for the future plain postbacks, the default values will never get overwritten. So this is how it works. So again, this view state process essentially would happen in, if you want to think about it, in 4 stages. The page gets requested, the default values will be reloaded, the view state, the C# code will be processed, and the default values, if they have to be repopulated using the C# code, they will be done, and the view states will be uploaded, and then the view states will be essentially processed to reload the server control values or other control values. And if they are disabled, then the view state field for those particular values will not be created. Now, if you look at server controls and many other controls, you see that not all controls have to rely on view state all the time. Some of the controls are able to maintain some of their own states. For example, text boxes, checkboxes, radio, and drop-down list could retain their values because they are, on the final look of the HTML markup, rendered as standard HTML controls. For example, a text box server control, when it's rendered in the browser in the final HTML markup, would be rendered as an input element whose type is text box, and or whose type is text. So when a page with such a text box is posted back, the browser also sends the value of the control back to the server, and this way the ASP runtime can simply look at that value and pre-populate the text box again, instead of having to read the value from view state. So apparently this makes it more efficient than relying on view states, because view states can contain a large number of values, and when you're sending the values back, you're going to send it twice if you're using the text markup or the text box elements. So as you can see, this becomes an extra process. So for this kind of elements that can retain their own states, we tend to disable them on the view state, so they would take care of their own values and states themselves, instead of running through the state engine and making the view state field even larger to pass back and forth from the server to the client. Because the view state engine adds a considerable amount of information to the page, it is usually a good idea to turn them off when you don't need them. So if you do this, you can minimize the size of the hidden view state field in the final HTML markup page. That means that your page becomes much smaller and it loads much faster into the browser. We can do this, or essentially turn off the view state, in 3 different places and in 3 different ways. We can do so at the website level. We can go to the web.config file in the root of the site and modify the pages element under the system.web element by setting the enable view state attribute to false. And here's the example that I showed in this slide. If we turn off the view state at this level or at the site level, we can't turn it on. We can't turn it on later for specific controls or for specific pages. The ASP.NET 4 offers a new view state mode property that lets us take control of how the view state is used. We can do this also turning off of the view state at the page level. And at the top of each page in in our ASP.NET websites, we have a page directive, and there are a series of instructions that tell the ASP.NET runtime how the page should behave. One of the directives is essentially the view state or enable view state for that page. And what we could make the enable view state equals false in the page directive. And this option is useful when we don't want to have the view state for a particular page at all. Then the third option is to control the view state at the control level. So at each ASP.NET Server control, we can enable the the view state for that particular server control by setting its enable view state to false. And this way we can turn them off while leaving the others on if we need them. However, once you turn off a view state at a higher level, such as page level or web config level for the entire site, you can't turn it on again in a lower level. So that's a limitation of turning off at the view states at a higher level. However, if we use the new view state property for the website, we can accomplish this. So what we can do is that we do not turn off the view state in the web config file. At the page level, we set the view state to true and the view state mode to disabled. And this turns off the view state for all controls in the page except for those that are explicitly enabled with the view state mode of the particular control at that particular control level. And then what we can do is that we will for each control, when we need the view state, we just add the view state mode to enabled in the ASP.NET Server control. So let me show you how it works. Let's take the enable view state out from the first server control we created, and let me add another label, and let's call this label 1, and let's go all the way up to the page directive, and let's type in view state mode disabled. This turns off the view state for all of the controls in the page. Now let me run this page, and let's go to the page up here. So this view state is disabled, so I click on set date. The date is typed in, and I click a plain post back. Because the view state is disabled, I don't have a view state, therefore the default values for the label will be shown. Let's assume that for the second server control, for the second label, for the first label, I want to have the view state enabled, and for the second label, I want to have the view state disabled. Let's go to the C# and let's run the label 1.text equals date time dot now dot to string. Okay, let me show you how this works now. Now, enabled view state mode is disabled for both files, and I run this for both labels, and when I click, the two labels are essentially showing the same date, and when I click post back, because neither one of them has view state, you won't be able to see anything. Just a cosmetic change, I added a line between the two view states, and here's how it works. I click on set date, both labels show the current date and time, and when I plain post back, both of them won't have view state because view state mode is disabled for the entire page, and therefore both of them will show the default values. Now let's go to the first label and makes its view state mode enabled. So view state mode equals enabled, and now let's run the page. Now in this case, the view state mode for the top label is enabled, view state mode for the bottom label is disabled. When I click on set date, both of them show the current date and time. When I click on the plain post back, the one whose view state mode was enabled retains the view state, or essentially retains its state, and the second one whose enable view state is not, or view state mode is not enabled, it will not retain its value and it shows the default value. The practical tips on using controls. As we saw last week, we need to try out as many server controls and standard controls and other types of controls as we need to get familiar with their functionality. Turn off the view state for controls that you don't need them to maintain their values across the postback, and just turn on those who you need their values to be kept for postbacks. What you could do essentially is, as I showed you, in the page directive, make the view state mode disabled, and then for the ones that you need to have view state, make the view state modes enabled for those particular controls. When you're designing a page, before you start a complex web form, just design it on paper and get an idea as to how your page should look like, and then start putting controls to your page as you need them. Experiment with view state and try to get a sense of how these view states and the process essentially works with the state engine of the ASP.NET. Now, in this part of the presentation, we saw the server controls and how they work from last week. We studied the state engine tonight and how it functions and how it maintains control values across the postbacks. We learned about the view state and what are its advantages and disadvantages, and we got a little bit of a glimpse on the server-side coding, and we will continue this in the next slides, in the next PowerPoint presentations. So with this, I close up the introduction to the server controls, and let's get a small and brief introduction to programming ASP web pages by C#.